Good morning. The question is, why shouldn't we be using peat? And if not, then what should we be doing instead? What we're going to cover is what is peat, the history and use of peat, the pros of peat moss as a soil amendment, the cons, what's not working, the environmental impact, and the potential alternatives to the use of peat. Okay, this is a peat bog. Some of them look different, but gives you the general idea. Peatlands form a unique ecosystem. Sphagnum moss, the main peat-forming species, can hold up to 20 times its own weight. In fact, I was so impressed with this, I have to show you this. Because 20 times its own weight is a bit amazing, really. And we'll talk about why this is important. This is the form that I received it in. I'm going to put it in here. This weighed 1/10 of an ounce. So I figured if I give it 2 ounces of water, that's how much water it would normally, can you still hear me? But look how it is, I don't know if you can see that, but it's growing already. Let's just pass that around and give you an idea. So, apart from the sphagnum moss, there are many diverse species, including reeds, sedges, heather, cranberries, and even carnivorous plants like the pitcher plant and sundew that can call the peat bog home. A peat bog looks like a saturated meadow with abundant sedges, rushes, and other grass-like plants, as well as occasional shrubs and sometimes scattered stunted trees such as the tamarack. This is what it looks like in its live form, and I think you can kind of get that idea from what I've just passed around here. This is what it looks like as a living plant. It has stems, leaves, and branches, but it has no true roots. It is usually the primary component of peat, but the development of peat includes other wetland plants such as sedges, shrubs, other sphagnum mosses, other vegetation. This is a core sample of peat taken in a Kentucky bog, which, as you know, Kentucky is a coal-producing state. The formation of peat is actually the first step on the way to the formation of coal, which made perfect sense to me when I became aware of that, but it hadn't dawned on me. The formation of peat is actually the first step. So in areas with poor drainage, where there is more precipitation than evaporation, the high water table saturates dead plant material and interferes with normal decomposition. Full decomposition requires plant debris to be processed by bacteria in an aerobic environment. It needs oxygen. This process requires higher oxygen levels than the water allows. So as the material goes down into the water, the air is cut off. The oxygen is not sufficient for the process to continue. As a result, the material begins to accumulate at a rate faster than the rate at which the bacterial decay can occur. And in this incomplete decomposition process, as it occurs year after year, the material builds up. The process of partial decomposition is called peatification. This is just another way of looking at the process. As you can see, up here in this area above the water level, you've got plenty of oxygen for the decomposition process. But as more vegetation falls down, the material is compressed and winds up below the water level, and then there's less oxygen to the point where there's no oxygen, and peat then begins to accumulate because the material is not completely decomposed. So here's reducing oxygen, increasing acidity. Okay, increased waterlogging as the process continues, and then decreasing composition. Most of the peat we use here in the U.S. comes from northern Canada, which, like Siberia, has peat moss about 15 feet deep. These numbers are impressive. However, Think about the fact that peat accumulates at a rate of approximately 1 millimeter or 1/32 of an inch per year. We're looking at an ongoing process that has continued for millennia when you're talking about 15 feet. And when there is sufficient pressure added to this process, again, over thousands of years, and under the right geologic conditions, this concentrated carbon-rich material may become coal. So you've got to have other conditions, but that it would be the process. Okay. Here in the U.S., we are familiar with coal as a heat source and may even remember its use in our own homes. I, of course, do. There are many areas around the world where oil, natural gas, and coal are not available for heating. Ireland is probably the country that comes to mind when you think about dependence on peat as a fuel. We've been talking about all the water in the bogs and fens. For the peat to be useful as a fuel, it must first be laboriously dug out and cut from the bogs by hand and then carried to storage to dry. That looks heavy, considering that that's still not dry. Okay. As you can see in this picture, the process of hand digging peat continues to this day, and in many areas where it's still most readily available as a fuel source, people still dig the peat moss for fuel. Mostly it continues in places where they're unable to import any other fuels. Demand for peat as a growth medium or a soil amendment began in the 40s and 50s, 1940 I should specify, and has increased since. As a result, from its humble beginnings as a way to meet our very local fuel needs, the extraction of peat has developed into an entire international industry. You can begin to imagine the scale of the operation when you see this image of the machines involved in the extraction process. And there are changes to the ecosystem as the extraction process continues to meet the demand for peat. This is how peat looks when we purchase it for horticulture use. Peat is currently used as a soil amendment, in soilless mixes, and as a growing medium for starting seeds. Most commercial potting soil and triple mixes currently contain peat. So why is peat so popular in the U.S.? To start with, its spongy, fibrous texture improves the soil texture. It improves water retention by allowing more air into the soil, and it allows excess water to drain, all of which the roots love. Under sandy soil conditions, peat will hold and release water, making it available for plant roots. Okay, as a seed starting medium, peat is often touted as essentially sterile, but that is really a misconception. Although it comes from an anaerobic environment where most organisms can't survive, it can't be sterile for two reasons. One would be the extraction process, and the other would be transporting, bagging it, whatever else is involved. Things may be introduced that are undesirable, but for the most part, you can consider it not to be a source of weeds and pathogenic fungi and so forth. So, peat is also inexpensive and it's lightweight. However, peat does not provide nutrients in your lawn or garden, but its absorbency, its ability to retain moisture, does mean that it will help to retain the nutrients that you add when you put fertilizer on the garden. All of these positive attributes apply to peat when it's used to help start a lawn as well as a garden, vegetable garden or a flower garden. And finally, as a mulch, it does suppress the growth of weeds, it retains moisture, and it moderates the soil temperature. All of the things that we're looking for from a mulch. We understand the moderation of temperature by our own experience here living by the lake, because if you live closer to the lake tend to keep cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. Now we're going to look at some of the issues around the extraction of peat. Okay. Reasons to reconsider whether we should be extracting peat. Peat is a nutrient-poor medium, and as mentioned, fertilizer must be used with it. Okay. Because sphagnum moss can retain up to 20 times its own weight in water, peat bogs are critical to prevent flooding. The bog absorbs huge amounts of precipitation, and the water is then gradually released into the streams and rivers. The first step in extracting peat is the creation of ditches to drain the water. When extracting peat, the ditches are dug before stripping the peat for sale. As a result, the flood protection provided by the bog is lost, and downstream flooding danger is greatly increased. Third reason we should reconsider our destruction of the bog is that the wetlands provide a very unique ecosystem. In addition, we've already mentioned some of the unusual plants that grow there, the sphagnum moss, the reeds, sedges, heather. I thought this is the pitcher plant, the sundew, and this is the tamarack or eastern larch, which all prefer to grow in a bog. Okay, the fourth reason is to halt the extraction is our inability to restore the bogs. So far, in spite of best efforts, bogs have proven to be a non-renewable resource. Fifth, the need to drain the bogs for the extraction means that the water in the surrounding area for human consumption may get contaminated. And importantly, the risk of forest fires, wildfires, may increase when a bog is drained. The bog itself acts as a natural barrier with the water that it provides. It helps prevent the spread of wildfires. These are a few of the animals that might be affected. Just a sampling. This was actually from a site in Minnesota where there are a number of bogs. And I was a little surprised to see the moose on there, but they like it in the bogs, I guess. All right, in Scotland, there are currently about 20 active extraction sites. The majority of extracted peat there is used for horticulture, with smaller amounts used for whiskey production, animal bedding, mushroom growing, and local domestic heating. Scotland is now attempting an ambitious plan to restore peatland in order to deliver other benefits to society, including providing important habitats, improving the quality of the water, and reducing flood risk. So they have obviously noticed some problems as they've stripped the peat from the bogs. But the images on the screen show the restoration progress after 2 years. And we know that peat accumulates at the rate of 1/32 of an inch per year. So while all 6 extraction effects we've looked at are important, they are not the most compelling reasons to treat peat bogs as non-renewable. The most compelling reason is not visible. Peatlands store more carbon than all other vegetation types in the world combined. Peat bogs store up to 44% of all soil carbon. I remember being very concerned about the Amazon. They're taking the trees down. We weren't necessarily, it was a good idea and it's important, but this is even more important. Peat soils contain more than 600 gigatons of carbon, and I had to look that up. A gigaton equals 1 billion metric tons, and a metric ton equals 2,205 pounds. So you're talking about a lot of carbon. And this is another way just to visualize the importance of the wetlands in the storage of or sequestration of carbon if it's left intact. It's when we take it apart that we lose this ability to sequester the carbon. This gives you boreal forest, temperate forest, tropical forest here on the top, deserts and semi-deserts, tundra, but here are the wetlands, okay? And it's really more than any of the other sources of soil sequestration of carbon. Okay. Peat is reported to release significant quantities of stored carbon dioxide, with the commercial extraction removing 500 years of accumulation in just 1 year. In Canada, which is the source for the vast majority of the peat coming into the U.S., recommendations allow for harvesting as deep as 10 to 20 feet, which will ultimately remove 6,000 years worth of peat growth. So 10 to 20 feet doesn't seem like a whole lot when you're running a commercial operation, but 6,000 years worth of growth kind of puts it in perspective. So, due to the slow rate of accumulation of peat, the current use of this natural resource is considered unsustainable, as apparently is that word. Okay. In the UK, the government is working to phase out the extraction of peat completely by 2030. But in the US, we currently have no such initiatives, probably because we don't really extract peat, we import it. But we can potentially influence the market by changing our habits. A change in our demand for the product can ultimately make a difference. Finding an alternative to peat is a good place to start. So, what are the alternatives available to gardeners? How do the alternatives compare to peat, and what are their pros and cons? The first we'd like to look at is coconut coir. I think this is probably the one that most of us are familiar with. Although, somebody want to come and grab this? I don't know if you've ever actually seen coconut coir. I've seen it as the bottom of a basket to put a plant in. But I was curious as to how are you going to mix that really coarse fiber into the soil. And so this is the form that it would come in if you were using it for house plants or something on a small scale. I presume you can buy it in much larger bags if you're going to be using it in your garden. But I just wanted to give you an idea what that actually looks like, because that coarser stuff on the outside there, this is all I could imagine, and I thought that's not going to work very well. The only carbon footprint is the only downside of the coconut coir because it's being shipped from Asian countries. So the carbon footprint from India, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, places like that, add expense to it and the fuel involved. But it is a natural product of the Asian coconut industry. It's a renewable alternative, which is a major plus, and it easily absorbs water even when it's dry, while peat tends to be water repellent when it's dry. And I always thought it was just me. I feel like I'm fighting it, trying to get it moist to put it in the pot for the winter sowing. You've probably noticed that when peat is dry, it pulls away from the side of the pot. And it doesn't matter how hard you try, it seems as though the water just runs over to the gap and runs out of the pot. Coconut coir decays slowly compared to peat, which is good, so it retains its soil structure helping abilities, and it's also more acid neutral than peat, which suits the majority of plants. Notice, please, that of all the alternatives that we'll discuss, coconut coir is the only non-peat material suitable for seed starting and container planting, as well as to use in the garden. The rest of the materials we're going to look at are suitable for garden use, but not for container or seed starting properties. purposes. Okay. Okay, wood fiber or sawdust improves the soil texture as well. However, as a soil amendment, it must be composted before use because of the problem of potential nitrogen depletion in the soil. This problem has led many people to believe that wood products are toxic to the plants. The problem actually is that the microorganisms that need to do the decomposing of the material, of the wood, require 1 to 2% nitrogen to get on with their work. Most uncomposted sawdust contains only a few tenths of 1%. So the microorganisms go and take the nitrogen out of the soil, which does not leave it there for the plant's purposes. So if it is sufficiently composted, that is not a problem. The breakdown has already occurred, and it will not be robbing the soil of nitrogen. So be aware that if you're adding uncomposted material, you will need to research the appropriate ratio of nitrogen to wood material. Any kind of nitrogen fertilizer can be used. And here we have somewhat the same problem. This is another alternative to peat. Like sawdust, wood chips can help with water retention when used to top a garden bed. However, mixing bark, wood chips, or even sawdust in the soil is not recommended, the problem being the nitrogen depletion. And I would say that the sawdust would be easier to work with in that it will break down faster. You need to allow as much as 2 years for some, depending on the size of the wood that you're dealing with, for it to break down sufficiently to use in the garden without adding nitrogen. Most wood products have a pH value of 3.5 to 7.0. Unless plants are especially sensitive to soil pH, incorporation of compost wood materials should not have a negative impact on soil pH. Plants such as blueberries, azaleas, and rhododendrons prefer the slight acid acidification with the use of sawdust or bark. Compost. Compost is the result of decomposition, as you know, of plant materials, including grass clippings, kitchen scraps, shredded paper, cardboard, fall leaves, which means that it's a nutrient-rich growing medium. Compost can be incorporated into planting media as a mulch, and it costs nothing more than the effort of the gardener. If processed properly, there should be no odor, and both pathogens and weed seeds should be killed off. However, a word of caution: most home composts do not achieve a high enough temperature to kill pathogens or weed seeds, and therefore it's recommended that you not compost any potentially diseased plant material. I just mentioned fall leaves as a possible component of compost, but you might want to compost just the leaves from your yard as an alternative compost, as an alternative to peat. Instead of bagging the leaves, just rake them up and enclose them in a wire or mesh screening, and eventually they will become a crumbly brown-black carbon-rich material that's ready to be added directly to the garden or used as a mulch. It requires time, but it's a lot less work than compost. This is not one that I had heard of before. Rice hulls, or the skin from rice grain that is removed before the rice is packaged for and sold for consumption. These hulls are generally discarded. However, when they are preserved, they can be used as a beneficial soil additive. I think I'm actually going to try this one. They are thin and nearly weightless. They help lighten the soil. They improve drainage and aeration and aid in water absorption. Rice hulls are non-toxic and biodegradable and feed the soil as they break down. If you choose to use rice hulls in the garden, mix them into the topsoil 6 to 12 inches. And the pH of the rice hulls is neutral, which helps balance the pH of the soil. Rice hulls are available in up to 50-pound bags at farm supply and big box stores. Many people believe they should avoid pine needles as a mulch or compost because the needles have a pH of 3.2 to 3.8 and will therefore alter the pH of the soil. In fact, it's very difficult to grow anything underneath a pine tree, and this has led to the belief that you should not use pine needles. The reason that it's hard to grow things underneath is because the plants are competing for sunlight. They're also competing for general resources, basically. The other issue was the roots of the evergreen are very close to the surface, and they're generally pretty widespread. So it makes it particularly difficult for the plants to compete anything that you might try to plant underneath. However, the needles do neutralize in terms of their acidity as they decompose, and the needles can be left to decompose underneath the tree where they will aid the tree with water retention. They'll suppress weeds, which you know just by looking at a pine tree, and they will eventually add nutrients for the evergreen. Alternatively, the pine needles could be collected and put into compost, but it's important that you not use higher than 10% of your compost with the pine needles. Shredding the pine needles will also help speed up the decomposition if you choose to use them. Okay, composted manure. Manure from farm animals such as cows, horses, sheep, goats, llamas, and chickens has a long history of use as soil amendments. Local farmers may be more than willing to offer manure free of charge because it does reduce the amount that they have to handle safely. Manure from livestock is a renewable organic source of nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, although the amount of each nutrient will depend on the diet of the animals. And as an organic amendment, manure will help the soil retain moisture over time. When adding manure to your soil, be sure to let it fully compost before spreading it. It's recommended that pig manure not be used and that all manure be composted at a temperature of 140 degrees Fahrenheit in order to kill parasites and to reduce seeds from weeds. Again, consider the problem of insufficient temperature achieved in home compost piles. Fresh manure is also more acidic and has a higher concentration of nutrients, particularly nitrogen, which in a higher concentration may be damaging to the plants. Excuse me. If using manure products in a vegetable garden, you must follow good agricultural practices and allow the appropriate amount of time to lapse between the application of the manure and the planting the crops the following season. Please note at the bottom of the page there, if you would like an analysis of the manure that you are adding to your garden soil, Penn State University Soil Analysis Lab does offer manure testing. Who knew? And I think I may have an alternative here that might surprise you. Apparently, the use of sheep's wool predates the use of peat as an amendment to improve soil structure and retain water. It also serves to help regulate soil temperature. So you can imagine, does the same thing for the soil that it does for us. That's why we wear wool. And unlike peat, it has the advantage of being a slow-release fertilizer, releasing nitrogen over time as it decomposes. It also provides trace amounts of potassium, sodium, iron, and phosphorus. And obviously it is a renewable resource that is environmentally friendly. About 10 years ago, a process was developed in Germany to create pellets of the wool, which makes it much easier to handle. And if you look online, you will find pellets are now available in the US. In conclusion, I came across this clever line that said, "Leave peat in bogs, not bags." This is not an exhaustive list, what I've just gone through with you. There are waste products from the production of wine and beer, production of olives, etc. I encourage you to explore and see what else you can find. Research into possible alternatives is ongoing, and I suggest that you stay informed as more information becomes available. And how do we go about finding current information? Of course, we suggest you do as the Master Gardener volunteers do, and I'm sure most of you do. Know your source. Okay. The .edu should tell you that the information is scientifically research-based. Look for the EDU sites. In the course of my research, I found a great deal of information indicating that, yes, the harvesting of peat creates issues, but nothing that we can't manage. And when I looked a little further into these sites, it was clear that the information provided was by people or businesses with a monetary incentive to minimize the effects on our environment and our climate so that they can sell their product, which is why we urge the EDU sites. Finally, what can you do as consumers? Read the labels on the materials that you buy. Just be aware of what you're actually purchasing. And finally, the Lake County Master Gardener Volunteers Helpline is available when you have questions. It's starting up again next month, which sounds good. We're getting to April. And there are actually only live people to answer the phone from 9 to 11 on Tuesdays from April through October. However, you can call at any time and leave a message and someone will get back to you.
Thank you so much, Rhonda.
Oh, thank you.